In WA, Aborigines are imprisoned at a rate 20 times that of non-Indigenous people. In the state's juvenile detention centres, more than 2/3 of the inmates are Aboriginal. Warren Mundine heads the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council and believes turning those figures around is vital to closing the gap on Aboriginal disadvantage. He wants to take Indigenous teenagers out of prison and put them back on the path to a productive, crime-free life. He spoke with me earlier from Sydney. Warren Mundine, welcome to 7:30 WA.
Okay, thank you.
Now, you want to take Indigenous teenagers from prison and put them to work. How are you actually going to do that?
Well, the idea is that we need to look at the incarceration rate of Indigenous people within the system. It's gone up 100% in the last 10 years. And for us, that's a ticking time bomb. We know that 90% of them will remain in the justice system right into adulthood until they die. And so we need to break out of that. So we also know from statistics, if we divert kids into jobs, into education programs, diversionary programs, that 80% of them you never see again.
Do you think prisons and the courts are really the right place to start in dealing with Indigenous disadvantage among teenagers?
Well, no, it's not actually, but you know, we've got to live with the history of it. We still have to start at the free school area, looking at childcare, looking at preschools and that, and building the education for kids up to the rest of Australia, and giving them the opportunities to move into jobs. But we've got to live with the fact that there are a lot of kids now in detention centres and going into the juvenile courts, and so we have to deal with that as well.
Now, you say you'll be targeting this at two levels, the courts and the detention centres. So just walk us through that. How will that work in the courts? Does it mean lesser sentences, different penalties? How will that actually work?
Oh no, we don't want to make it a soft on crime approach. The kids that'll be involved in these programs, we have to look at the criminal charges that are laid against them. You know, you don't want to be looking at murderers or rapists and that wandering around. But you know, we're looking at kids who will be going in under 3 months jail terms or 6 months terms, rather than putting in a detention centre that we actually tie them into a 3-year behavioural bond. We have strict conditions on that bond and monitoring of that process, and then they go into a job and training and a career path that breaks them out of that cycle. And of course, if there are other issues involved, such as drug and alcohol and that, then we need to deal with those issues as well.
And what about those who are already in the detention centres? How will it work there?
Well, in the detention centres, there's nothing like a captive audience. We'll say this is what you've got to do. You've got to go into this training program. You meet these employers, and we build a relationship between you and the employers. We'll put you out under condition, very strict conditions to work. If you behave yourself with the training programs to these employers, you have to work with them. We'll sort out accommodation and that, and breaking away from the criminal peer pressure groups that you're working with, and also again dealing with if you've got any drug and alcohol issues and that as well. So it's about doing that and working with the employers and that, and then through that process also dealing with the education.
So what are you hoping that it will accomplish in the end, Mr Mundine? A dramatic reduction in reoffending?
Well, I'm hoping over the next 3 years that we do have a reduction in that reoffending area, and also that we start breaking through the cycle where kids see crime and going into detention centres the only life for themselves. And that's the issue that we got. Sadly, some of these kids, this is the first time they've actually been to a school is in the detention centres. We have to make detention centres, not the cultural shift that kids go from home to detention centres, back on the street, back into the detention centres, and then on to larger crimes and into the jail system.
Now, I can see the appeal of this when there's a strong focus, as there is right now, on closing the gap. But in a state where there's also a strong push to crack down on crime, as soon as there's a violent home invasion, a bashing, a high-speed car chase involving Indigenous teenagers or youth, are you worried that this whole idea will just be washed away in the inevitable get tough on crime debate that follows?
Oh, I think it goes hand in hand with the get tough on crime, because we do have to be tough on crime, and I don't want to get into an argument about soft or tough on crime, because all we'll do is get beaten up over it. What we've got to do is look about the future victims. How do we stop future victims in the future? How do we get the crime rates down? And how do we have a sensible, tough approach to kids getting into jobs and getting into education programs and that? So we'll have very strong conditions. We have to work for the nitty-gritty of that, and this is the discussions that we'll have over the next few weeks with the Western Australian Government and the correctional services and that. And then from there, hopefully we want to do is by the end of this year have the program up and running.
Are you concerned about other policies that might be contributing to offending and incarceration rates of young Indigenous people in WA, like the government's 3 strikes eviction policy? Housing advocates say that policy may have made up to 2,000 Aboriginal children homeless, severely disrupting their education and driving some of them into crime.
Look, there's no doubt that accommodations are major issues in this area, and kids on the streets are a major issue in this area. But you know, we're very willing to work and help and play a role with the West Australian governments, because we do live under a federal system, which is the states and territories have. They're the main centre of this in regard to crime and the criminal justice systems. We want to work with that and help these states and territories through this process.
Housing advocates are arguing that this 3 strikes policy is really entrenching disadvantage for Aboriginal families and children and then feeding them back into that justice system that you're trying to keep them out of.
Well, we want to do 2 things. One is that they don't actually go into the justice system in the first place, so they're not committing crimes. And that's where that preventative measures come in. The other part of that was the program we're looking at now is how do we get them out of it. So we'll work with the West Australian Government. We're not going to do megaphone diplomacy and argue about these issues. We're going to sit down and deal with the real issues about how we can get kids out of juvenile detention centres, stop the crime rate, stop the victims of the future, and get these kids into long careers and a happy life.
Mr Mundine, thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you.